Hi, my name is Aswat Damodar. That's actually a lie, and let me explain why. For the first 19 years of my life, I was born and grew up in South India. I did not have a last name. My first name, Aswat, was the name I went by. It was the name that by which all the records were kept. And in fact, the reason for it is very simple. Caste names, which had been the traditional last names in that part of India, had become passe, and nothing had quite replaced them. Wasn't a problem for the first 19 years of my life, but then I set off on my college life, which happened to be in Los Angeles. So I remember the flight coming into LA. I was handed this form called the I-94 form, a form that's still around and hasn't changed very much over time. And I ran into a problem. It asked me for my family name or my last name, and I wasn't sure what to put down. So here's what I did. I took my dad's first name and I made it my last name. So that's a confession I want to start off with. Damodaran is really not my last name. It's my dad's first name. I'm used to it being my last name by now, but I had choices then. I could have chosen any number of different last names. I chose Damodaran, and I'm happy I did. But that led me thinking about naming and whether names can affect the course of your life and how you run a business. And I'm going to give you a story to kind of illustrate why names I think matter. I teach at NYU, and I've been doing this for a long time, almost 30 years. When I first came here, the across the street from the undergraduate business school where I used to teach some of my classes then was the campus coffee shop. And you see a picture there. It was an old-fashioned coffee shop. Old-fashioned in what sense? You went in, you ordered coffee, you got it in one flavor, bitter. The texture was like sludge. You were offered two add-ons, cream and sugar. There was no soy cappuccino or a venti cappuccino on the menu. The waiters and waitresses were crotchety old people, but the food was cheap. A coffee cost you 50 cents, an egg sandwich cost you $1. You got exactly what you paid for. About 15 years into my life at NYU, the landlord of the building where the coffee shop existed pushed it out. The landlord was this villain called NYU. And the new tenant was called the Campus Eatery. You've gone from coffee shop to eatery. No surprise here. The prices went up almost instantaneously. You got the same kind of egg sandwich, probably cost you twice as much. You were now offered cappuccinos that came out of machines. They tasted nothing like cappuccinos I'd tasted anywhere else. But for 15 years, the campus eatery also existed until last summer when I noticed it had been shut down. And the new restaurant had not quite opened, but the name came up before the restaurant opened. In fact, it just opened today. And the name that came up said Broad. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it right, but the thing that drew my attention was the umlaut. I've nothing against umlauts, but umlauts in New York are unusual, and I knew what was coming. And in fact, today's expedition that I made into that place confirmed it for me, which is the prices are going to go up even more. You're saying that's nothing to do with corporate finance and valuation. Well, everything has to do with corporate finance and valuation. So this led me thinking about why people change their names, why businesses change their names. The most common reason for individuals changing their names happens still to be marriage. The most common reason for companies changing their names is mergers and acquisitions. But there are four other reasons, more interesting reasons, why I think entities change their names. The first is to decontaminate. Now, this might sound a little off color to you, but I'm going to say it anyway. Do you know that Adolf Hitler had two siblings? I know their first names, and the only reason I don't know them is Wikipedia tells me their names. They were Paula and Alois. But after the Second World War, I don't think you wanted to go around the world telling the world your last name was Hitler. So guess what they did? Paula Hitler changed her last name to Wolf, and Alois Hitler changed his last name to Hiller. No surprise, right? Now, corporations sometimes run into a problem where their names get contaminated. I'll give you an example. About 15 years ago, Philip Morris decided to change its name to Altria. Why? Because tobacco by then had become a contaminant. You worried about the effect it had on how investors perceived your company. And it did it primarily to protect its other businesses, because at that time it owned a big chunk of Kraft and Miller Brewing, and it was afraid that tobacco was pushing down the values that investors were assessing to the companies. It changed its name. Whether it worked or not is a different question, but that was a classic example of a name change to get away from your past. So the first reason for name changes is to decontaminate. The second is to actually change the way you behave, the way you operate. Now you're saying, how can a name change do it? Maybe the name change is a precursor to what's coming. All too often, though, name changes, when they occur for this reason, reflect changes that have already happened. So in 2006, when Apple Computer changed its name to Apple, it was to reflect a reality that had already happened. It was no longer a computer company. It was getting almost 60% of its revenues from smartphones and devices and retailing. It changed its name to reflect something that had already happened. But in 1985, when International Harvester, a company that had a history of producing agricultural machinery, decided to change its name to Navistar, it did it because it had sold off its agricultural machinery business and wanted to enter the diesel engine and the chassis business, and was changing its name to reflect that change was coming. So the name change can sometimes be a lead-in to a change in the way you do business. The third reason to change your name is it might make it easier to market your product. Do you know that Google started life as Backrub? Now you're probably glad they changed that name, and I'm sure Larry Page and Sergey Brin also are. It might have been a lot more difficult to push that search engine out if it were called Backrub instead of Google. But companies can change their names in one of two ways. They can change their names to make them easier for people to recognize and relate to. So when Sony changed its name from Tushin Tokyo, whatever, a very traditional Japanese name to Sony, it made it easier for the rest of the world to recognize, and even perhaps for Japanese to recognize its products. In some cases, the name change might lead you to a more exotic name. Why? Because a more exotic name allows you to charge a higher price. A fact that Starbucks is taken to heart, because you walk into a Starbucks, what do you see? You don't see small, medium, large. You see, grande, venti. In a sense, you see a reflection that if you use Italian words in the US, you can charge a premium. So sometimes companies move towards their customer base in terms of making names more familiar, or sometimes away. In either case, there's a marketing imperative driving it. And there's a fourth reason why companies and individuals change their names. I'll give you the individual example first. There was this classic example of a German student who came over here, and over the course of years he kept changing his name, and ultimately ended up with the name of Clark Rockefeller, a name he picked obviously not randomly, but the very fact that he had that last name allowed him to get into clubs he otherwise would not have been led into, and into investment schemes that he otherwise would not have been able to promote. Ultimately he got arrested, but he made millions of dollars just with that last name. Companies sometimes do this as well, and the classic example for this is to latch on to whatever markets are valuing at that point in time highly and put it into your name. Remember the late 90s when companies added .com to their names? And in the last decade, companies wanted something related to commodities in their names, and right now they want a social media or a China component in their names. That companies sometimes do this, not so much because they want to change the way they operate, but because they want to fool investors and customers. So let's look at name changes and the consequences. Can name changes affect your value as a company? Before you scoff, let's look deeper. I think they can affect your value, and you can trace out the effect. If your name change was designed to decontaminate, and if that decontamination actually works, it should show up as more revenues, because customers who otherwise would not have bought your products because of that name will now buy your products. And at the higher revenues, you should get higher cash flows and higher value. If the name change is designed to be a precursor to operating changes, your value change should reflect that, right? Because you're going to change the way you do business, change the businesses you're in, change your investment financing and dividend decisions, and there should be an effect on value. If your name change is to market, and the marketing actually works by making it a product that people can recognize more easily, maybe you should be able to sell more. Your revenue should go up. Or if you use a more exotic name and it actually allows you to charge a premium for the same product, you should have higher margins and higher value because of that. If your name change was designed to fool, obviously there can be no value effect. But the key is there can be no value effect. There can be a pricing effect. In fact, the studies that I think are most interesting about the pricing effects of name changes all relate to the .com era, because part of the reason is that's not the only time people have done it, but the name changes were obvious. So during the late 90s, for instance, as this graph shows, lots of companies added .com to their name. So you see all the way through the late 90s, companies adding .com to their names. Why? Because people like .com. They thought by adding .com to their names, investors would price them more highly. Then you get to 2000 and the .com boom bust. And guess what companies start to do? They start to delete .com from their names. Classic lab experiment to see if names matter. So during the late 90s, researchers looked at what happens to the price of a stock when it adds .com to their names. And guess what they found? When companies add .com to their names, their prices jump by 30, 50, 80, 100%. Absurd, you say? Well, that's what we can argue about how absurd it is, but that's the pricing effect. When these companies changed their names, just adding .com without changing a thing about their operations, their prices jumped. And when they took them out of their names in 2001, 2002, 2003, guess what stock prices did? They went up. And this is not just with .com. In fact, there was another study I looked at that looked at companies that added oil or energy to their names between 2000 and 2007. It's a period when oil prices were going up. And guess what that study found? That stock prices increased. And this was looking at US and Canadian companies. So if you ask me, can value change as a consequence of a name change? I've got to think about the consequence. I would look at the cash flows. If you ask me, can the price change when the name changes? Absolutely. That price change will probably not stick for a long time if there are no substantial changes. But there's a price change, and it can be significant. Now I'm going to use this as my way of thinking about what Google did over the summer. Just a few weeks ago, Google announced a name change. The announcement, at least on the Google website, said that the company was going to be called Alphabet. It's a strange name if you ask me. But it was going to become a holding company. One of the biggest subsidiary of this holding company would now be called Google with all the Google products in there. So with all the traditional Google products, the Google products that we're used to, the Google search engine, YouTube, the add-ons that go on to that search engine. In fact, that advertising business, which is the core, which is the heart of Google, would now become Google. But Google would also have these startups. All these other ventures Google's on, the electric car business, the medical devices business, would now become individual subsidiaries, and they would all be under this Alphabet head. So it's worth thinking about why Google did what it did and whether it's going to work. The why seems, if you go through the 4 reasons we talked about, we can very quickly start to rule out some. It can't be to decontaminate. Google is one of the most prized brand names in the world. There's no reason to run away from it, so it can't be to decontaminate. It cannot be to market. It can't be easy to market an Alphabet product than a Google product. It has no resonance to it. It's not exotic. And it can't be to fool. It's not as if people look at the Alphabet and say there's huge potential here. The only reason you're left with is that Google wants to change. And that's strange, right? Because you're saying, why would a company, one of the most successful companies of the last decade, want to change? There are things that Google has done well. And what it's done well is it's built its advertising business, and it's been incredibly successful with the business. The only troubling aspect of Google's success over the last decade has been that it's other stuff that it's tried. They've had, high profile. The one that you probably can think of is Google Glasses. But there are other things Google has tried which have had huge profile, but none of them have generated profits. So if there's a troubling aspect to Google's last 10 years, it's been that everything else they've tried outside of advertising doesn't seem to have worked in terms of generating revenues and profits. So maybe this Google Alphabet renaming is designed to fix that. So let's think about what it might be about Google's current setup that might be getting in the way of their startup succeeding. And here I'm completely hypothesizing. And I'll make a confession. And a few people pointed this out to me yesterday already, and I'll agree to it up front. I don't know very much about the tech business. I've never been in the insides of Google, so this is just my guessing about what could have gone on here that has caused Google not to succeed in those other businesses. Here's my first diagnostic. I think Google has a sugar daddy problem. The sugar daddy, of course, is the advertising business, and the young startups are like kids. And basically, for the last decade, these young startups have had access to the sugar daddy with incredible capital, and that might have led to the way these startups have been run. Maybe the people running these startups, because they have access to so much capital, they have that fallback, have become sloppy in the way they make investment decisions, the choices they make about what products to develop. I don't know whether that's the case, but that's one potential problem. The second potential problem that might be getting in the way of Google's successes is that in spite of all of its successes, the way I would describe Google is it's been run as a benevolent dictatorship. Larry Page and Sergey Brin dominate the company. They dominate the company to the point that they suck all the oxygen out of that publicity tank. You hardly ever hear about anybody below Larry Page and Sergey Brin. In fact, when Google created its Google subsidiary and named Sundar Pichai as the new CEO, the fact that most of us hadn't heard much about him is testimonial to his self-effacing nature and his humility, but it's also testimonial to the fact that Google as a company, the names that come to the forefront when you think about the company remain its co-founders. So maybe that's getting in the way of these startups doing the right thing. As I said, I'm just guessing, but let's see if in fact the name change can shift this. Here's what I'd be looking for to see if the name change will be working at Google. I want to see evidence that the startups are actually behaving differently now with the name change than they did before the name change. What would that mean? I want the startups to behave like startups, lean, mean, hungry, looking for new products, looking for those pathways to revenues and earnings. Because as a startup, without the kind of backing from a sugar daddy that these startups have historically, you're looking to get to the market and to make money. And I'm looking for Google advertising, which is the supplier of capital, to behave like a traditional venture capitalist, which is you're looking for the best use for your money. And if the best use is not within Google, you're willing to go elsewhere. So I'd like to see a little more brutality in this process. And maybe that's what you need. I'd also like to see more independence given to the people who be running the subsidiaries at Google to do what they want to do. And the evidence to me will be of that independence will be when one of them, let's say Sundar Pichai, decides to do something that is directly in contradiction to what Page and Brin would want him to do. I'd like to see evidence of that, because if that happens, there's been a substantial change, and that substantial change perhaps will pay off as Google's other businesses succeeding. Personally, I think the odds of it happening are pretty low, given Page and Brin's history. But I'm not going to deny that possibility up front, so I'm going to leave the door open to the change. I give them better odds than I gave Ron Artest. Those of you who don't remember, he was an NBA player with anger management problems when he changed his name to World Peace. A completely incongruous shift where there was zero chance he was going to change as a person. I give Google better odds than that. The bottom line, though, is the naming game matters. I wonder about this. If I'd chosen a different last name on that flight into LA, would the course of my life been different? I would like to think no, that the substance of my life would not have changed if I'd chosen but I really don't know. Names matter for better or worse, and we can debate how much they matter, but we can't rule out the possibility that what you name your business could affect its value.